Hello, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around doing something in the world. I'm your host, Florence Adu, and I am on my last day of being 6 months or more in New York, and I'm so excited to be getting on a plane this evening. And I was so lucky to catch up with a friend who's halfway across the world right now. It's going into the evening there, and we're just bright and early in the morning here. But I'm really excited for this conversation. It's been long overdue to happen. So my guest this week is Jonas Ingemann Parby. He is a senior urban specialist at the World Bank. He leads the urban program currently at the World Bank in Nepal, where he's based, and he's based in Kathmandu. He's worked in Latin America, the Caribbean region, Ghana, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Mauritania. So he is a world traveler, global citizen, if there is ever one. I won't tell you where he's from. I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. But Jonas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Yes. So tell us more about where you're from, where you're local, and what is your craft?
So, thanks a lot once again for having me. Yeah, so I'm originally from Denmark. I grew up in a small village about 30 miles from Copenhagen, and my childhood there, very happy and playful childhood. So it shaped me a lot, I think, in many ways. And right now I'm basically working as an urban specialist, as you mentioned. Worked in development in the last, I would say 15 years, I guess it is now. And I think pretty early on realized that this would be one of my most important passions in life, and that I wanted to dedicate and invest my life in trying to work on improving the lives of others, so to speak, if you can say such a lofty thing. So that has been sort of where my passion and my engagement has been for the last many years. And I think a lot of where I came was probably also shaped by both, different influences, both from my parents and from friends and from different events in my youth that also, I think, inspired me to move in this direction. So it's now, I think I'm clocking 12 years at the World Bank. So I'm also quite a veteran in that, but I'm still finding every day new, I think, inspiration, new ideas and new insights, through this very unique, I think, place and very privileged place, I think, also that we sit in. So that's been great. And I hope to continue long further on.
So tell us a little bit more about where you grew up in Denmark. And you mentioned, you think that shaped a lot of how you were able to and move into the spaces you are. Tell us a little bit more about, I've never been to Denmark. I have a few Danish friends, and the pictures I see are always so beautiful. So tell us more about that.
So I grew up in a village. It was really a village of about, I think, 1,000 people. Now it's slightly bigger. And my parents moved from Copenhagen when my brother was very young, and I was born and raised in that village. And I had, I think, it was obviously a very quiet and stable environment, but at the same time, I think very inspiring in the sense that I had a lot of freedom. I could always roam around. I could always take my bike, go everywhere I wanted, and do without any fear of dangers and so on. So it nurtured definitely something probably I already had, that was always engaging in going, exploring and going to the next and seeing new things, even if it was within that small village. And then as I grew older, I think from my parents, especially sort of the global outlook and interest in global events and things that were happening, the end of apartheid, Palestine conflict, I think sort of big global issues, even though we were in that small environment, came up and the discussions, and, obviously made us very much aware that we were just part of a much bigger world out there. And then I think when I was about 20, one of my best friends got married in Peru. He left Denmark and spent a couple of years in Peru as a young high school student. And he eventually got married. And one summer after the wedding, I spent 3 months working as a volunteer with street children in Peru in the Andes region, in the mountains, and basically was throwing in front of them with some minimal, actually no Spanish at all, just a bit of French, and then just catching up day by day and communicating and engaging with them and making activities that would help them sort of get away from whatever difficult backgrounds they were from. And so that was a very inspiring kind of period for me. And when I came back, I think I felt that was something that I would like to see and do more of different ways. Mm-hmm. So that was a very, very special, I think, time and a very inspirational visit for me to Peru. First time, I think it was actually outside of Europe in those days. So
okay. Wow. So you mentioned you had some French and you were navigating with these children speaking Spanish. So they basically taught you Spanish.
Yeah, I had a little yellow dictionary that I looked in every day, English, Spanish. And then I every time there was a word, if I didn't know it, I would try to throw in some French and see if that worked. And otherwise, I would have to go to the dictionary. So, I mean, just with basic communication, there were ages from 3 to 10. It was kind of combined and did a lot of work on arts and stuff that could be nonverbal. So it was not teaching as such. It was more like activities. And so playing soccer, playing sports. Yeah, it was great. And soon after, then, of course, I came back and I studied more Spanish and I became much more comfortable in it. And it nurtured also already at that point. I'd had a great love and affection for languages. And so in high school, I had taken, of course, French and I had taken others. So that continued also as part of this global, I think, passion or international outlook in some ways. So, yeah.
That's so funny because the first time I went to Mexico, I went to Puerto Vallarta and I speak French as well. And so I was doing the same thing. I basically was like, they would say something and I would think in French and try to test it and see what happened. And so, that makes a lot of sense. So speaking of languages, how many do you speak now?
Well, I must admit, I think I've stayed with more the European languages. So I have not been able to pick up, for instance, here in Nepal, where we've lived now for about a year, I haven't been able to pick up very much as I would have wanted to. But I speak probably I would say 5, no? So Danish and German, English, Spanish, and French. So those I can definitely have full conversations and get by and understand newspapers and so on. So, but after that, I did have another a period when I was very young, I think 21, 22, and I tried to even take on Chinese while I was studying full time, as if I could do, I was seeing myself maybe slightly superhuman. And true enough, after a few months, very intense trying to learn this extremely complicated and complex language, I decided to give it up. But I'm sure there'll be more options. And Nepal is Nepal is obviously easier, both grammar-wise, but also just because we live here. So it's going to be hopefully something we can have at least sort of a basic vocabulary.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So let me get to my why the where question, because you've mentioned where you are and being there for a little bit of time. So how did you come to be living, working, and playing where you're living now?
Yeah, so now I arrived here in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, basically almost 1 year ago, a little more than 1 year ago. And it was a big dream that I've been living almost, 9-10 years in Washington, D.C., and had come to a sort of a sentiment of feeling that this was a time to shift gear a bit and move and be back where things actually happen when you work in this space of international development. And so I had been eager to do that even for a while. And then we was lucky enough that life circumstances fell together very nicely, that on the one hand, my wife and I, we had a daughter, and on the other hand, we were both eager to take 2 chapters, so both having a child as well as leaving the US and going out. So we looked for different options, and then this came up, and we both felt very connected to the idea of Nepal. And though none of us had been here, we felt that this was something where we could both thrive, and read about it. And then we fortunate enough to get actually the position, or I was fortunate enough to get the position. And so that's how I arrived. So now I live I'm sitting here, it's Sunday night, as you mentioned, and it's dark outside. I'm sitting here in the guest room. My wife and daughter are almost about to sleep, but we have been hiking today and have been enjoying the scenery of this city. And so this weekend is definitely for play. Next week is a very busy work week, so I managed to focus on this and have this time dedicated to family and just enjoying the neighborhood. So we live in a small neighborhood which is quite rural in a way, so it's very green and we can see the mountains from the house. So it's something that inspires us in the sense of feeling really or a part and parcel of a new experience, both with all the sounds and the smells and the sights and the good and bad. Of course, it's not just all rosy things, but we feel very much at home, and I've been lucky to meet fantastic people here already. So that's it.
Yeah. So had you been to Asia before you landed in Nepal?
Yes, I'd never explored South Asia that much. I've been in Sri Lanka. Actually, I lived more than a year in Cambodia about 15 years ago. And then I had been also living in Thailand, actually, also about 17, 18 years ago. And then, so I knew Southeast Asia quite well, but the South Asia region, I've never, this whole subcontinent, I've never really had a chance to visit. So yeah, so it's a big jump into the unknown. But I had heard good things, and I had consulted with friends and also actually some Nepali colleagues that I know. And yeah, so it was not completely unknown, but definitely it was a jump. But very, very happy to have done it.
Okay. So speaking of all of your local experiences, this is where I ask my Glocal Speak question. So we want to hear what you hear. Especially since you're so new there, I'm thinking your ears might be sensitive to a lot of different new terms and you're absorbing a lot. So this is where I ask you to share a word, phrase, or saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience and why or how you came to value this as Glocal Speak.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one that comes to mind in Nepal is the word namaste, which is a greeting that you say, and you hold your hands together in front of your face, which basically means I bow to you, I bow to you. So it's something that in a way signifies well how the culture, I think, sort of evolves here. My impression of it, of course, it's not only the only part of it, but it's incredibly respectful, polite, but at the same time very warm and very sincere. And so that's something that I think a lot of the people at least I've met, it's made me feel, even when you have communication barriers, if people don't speak English and you don't speak Nepali, you still feel that across vibrations being sent between people. So that's something that I think is a very important term, even to the extent that my daughter, who's now little over 1 year, we've almost taught her to not to say it because she can't do that yet, but to move her fingers, her hands together, greeting. So that's very sweet. So now she's already street smart in Nepal.
Yes, nice. A nice little polite little lady. It's so funny because, I first came across Namaste. I'm a yogi, so in yoga. And I think yoga culture has in some ways done a disservice because so much of it in the West is just this kind of workout and it's not the actual sentiment of this energetic. I love that you said the energy of the appreciation and the thoughtfulness of really seeing someone. So I feel like I've personally looked at that myself, but I like that you've expressed that so that people really understand that it's not just a word. It really means greet, I thank you, I bow to you, and peace be with you, basically. So thank you for that. So let's get into what it means to be an urban specialist at the World Bank, because that has been, so you tell us a little bit about your journey at the World Bank, because you're my first World Banker. And so, I mean, as in being some consultants, but you're the first proper World Banker that I've had on the program. So, tell us about your journey and how you moved from different places, how you became an urban specialist. Tell us more about that.
So when I came to the World Bank it was 2009, almost just around the time of Obama's election, actually the first election. That was basically I was fortunate to benefit from the Danish government's junior professional officer kind of program, which is a program in which Danish government supports Danish citizens to obtain jobs in different international organizations. And so through that program, I started working at the bank. And at that point, it was not particularly urban. It was it was a unit that worked in East Africa, including Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi. And then because of my my background, technical background from university, working with local authorities and more local development and also urban issues, then I managed to shift to another department basically within the bank after a year or so, because I felt that would be more suited to my interest and my background. And since then, I just then gradually expanded my experience and worked on a lot of countries and took different additional sort of specialized, let's say, trainings in areas where I felt I was maybe not so strong, and build on all of that. And very much enjoy, I think, the kind of the space which is between, I mean, it's complex because you work in a space between national government, local governments and citizens, and you try to find the sweet spot where everything sort of connects and where decisions at different levels and and actually implementation obviously becomes real. So it's not, I mean, I think all sectors have their own complexities, but of course, urban specifically can be also politically very complex because you have mayors of certain parties that are representing and pursuing certain goals, and then you have other visions from national level leaders, and sometimes they don't play well together. So I think we know that from many countries, even the US, and also, of course, some of my experience in Denmark. So that's something you need to navigate. So it can be incredibly challenging, but at the same time, it's very inspiring because you can have strong and passionate local leaders that know what they want and that are very articulate and very clear on their vision, and you can help support them, realize such visions. Then you have achieved a lot, and that can be, I think, sometimes very inspiring, even compared with working with national level leaders. So that's been one of the drivers. And then, of course, when you work with citizens, also you're closer to communities, you're closer to citizens, because the activities, the kind of projects you do are much, let's say, more concrete in many ways. I mean, you build a road from X to Z, or you build a school through a project, or you build a health center. So it's quite much more quick and concrete, even in scale. It's not necessarily going to change the whole city, but it can have very, very powerful micro impact. So that's another, I think, inspiration. Mm-hmm. And then I think the last is obviously that you have sectors that are so, I mean, you can do many things in a city. You can do anything. You can talk about how you create jobs or how you get kids to access school, or it can be anything, right? So it's also very complex, but within that, there's also an incredible amount of opportunity to pick your fights and then to try to make changes to that particular city, of course, over time.
Sure. So let me ask you to be a little bit more specific. So give us a situation of, first of all, how you become engaged, right? So everyone knows the World Bank is the World Bank. They do, this quote unquote development work, what have you. But what are the mechanics of you coming into, say, I met you in Ghana. So you've told me a little bit about your project in Ghana and working in these urban settings. So tell us more about how you facilitated getting in and the local leadership that you worked with and the kind of impact that you were able to see.
Yeah, so I think the way to the first question, the way we get in is basically through, of course, a government decides that they want to seek additional support from outside, from their own resources. And so then they would seek partnership with different stakeholders, including the World Bank. And then we would come in and we would then start technical dialogue, of course, with the ministries or with the mayors and figure out, okay, what are the problems that they see? What are the key issues that they want to resolve? And how can we help them in any way in terms of either, it can be, of course, a lending, what we call an investment project, or it can be some kind of policy analysis or technical report, which is also a very big part of what the World Bank is doing. And then after that, you would basically have these conversations and discussions and consultations to figure out, okay, what is it that they want to do? And you start identifying a concrete issue, a concrete problem, either it's geography-based, that a certain part of the city is completely flooded every year, or that, that there's a complete lack of jobs in certain part, or there's a slum area which in dire need of upgrading, or something similar, right? That would be very concrete. And then at the same time, of course, beyond just infrastructure, we also, one of the key issues, I think, is always to try to build and strengthen institutions. So how you support making institutions more efficient, where be it in providing information to the citizens, in collecting taxes, in sharing the plans with citizens of, okay, what are the next changes that will happen, or it can be basically anything over and above. That of course transparency as well is very important, that resources are managed and effectively, and that they are accounted for and so on, so that you have reduction of fraud. So those are the key parameters. And then finally, I think on the examples, there are many different that I think have been powerful to me. I think the one that comes to mind is, I think, also an upgrading project we did in Kigali, actually, where we did an urban upgrading project that basically to help resolve some major deficiencies, both in terms of access to service for people living there, in terms of health challenges and other things that where the program helps support and resolve or contribute to resolving those issues. So that is one. And I think others would be in Accra, where over several months, several years, so to speak, we managed to start a dialogue around how Accra can resolve its problems with flooding, which has been one of the recurrent issues over there, and how the city can start building, basically look to the future over and above 4 years of the usual policy cycle, but actually try to resolve the problem over time. So that's another one where, concretely, now there's an ongoing resolution for solid waste problems and trying to fix some of the key issues that cause this flooding every year. So visually, those are some of the examples, but I think it's also should be said that I think one key lesson is obviously that you need sometimes enormous amount of patience, because both our institution is not always the most fast, and we are not always more agile to adapt to the reality on the ground. And then secondly, we are also we're working with politically elected leaders with their own priorities and own, let's say, sometimes different ways. So that can also cause huge delays in terms of getting things done. So it really depends a lot on some of these parameters, and that's why you need sometimes an enormous amount of patience. And it can be frustrating. It can be frustrating. That should not be underestimated. You're not always in control because you try to work with so many stakeholders. So it's not as just running your own company, right? So that's, I guess, my reflection.
I think policy, all levels, is this constant exercise in patience, right? So from moving, in my own experience working in policy, I think some people in the private sector often look at those who've worked in policy and they say, wow, you're just so chill about everything. It's like, well, I'm used to this. So it's really good training for how to understand. And it's not just in this development space. I think looking at how quickly things move in the West versus the way things move in the developing world, everything takes a lot of time. And it often is dependent upon funding, but it's also, culture, style, all of those things that you mentioned that are part of, how and what kind of stands in the way of getting things done. So tell us more about what your project is like in Nepal and what you've experienced there.
Yes, so I would say the last point on the other aspect is also something actually from here in Nepal, which is that I think one thing that balances out sometimes the patience and the tediousness of which can occur in certain countries is also individuals and leadership. And so when you find the sweet spot of working with someone by one way or the other, coming across someone who really wants to drive an agenda and has the clout to do that, and then you can also achieve amazing things in partnership, in collaboration. And so that's something I've experienced, I think, in many places, and it can really be the difference between succeeding or failing, right? So here in Nepal, it's been one thing, one project which I think I came at the tail end, but is a very interesting one, is around protecting cultural heritage in part of Kathmandu and promoting jobs, let's say, and preserving skills, because Nepal has a very rich tradition of skills in let's say, in traditional artisanry and arts. And so, but those skills are not automatically passed on from generation to generation. Right. And in a context of Nepal, where almost 25% of the GDP derives from migrant workers sending money back, you can imagine that for a young person here, it's always going to be a big consideration to try to opt for one of the rather risky, but still it is an opportunity to move abroad to try to get some sort of income. And so in that context, preserving those skills and making jobs that can stay within Nepal are very important. And this mayor, particularly in this particular municipality, I think was one of the examples that I was very impressed about, and someone who remains, I think, very inspirational for his citizens in the way that he promotes and acts and delivers on what he promises. So recently there was actually in this city, which is actually unfortunately one of the more polluted ones in the world, there was opening of a bike lanes, the first dedicated organized bike lanes, let's say, in the city. And so this was a symbolically very important event, but also it's hopefully something for the future that will be expanded further. And I think the mayor was was definitely, let's say, the driver behind those changes. So that's been just my local. I mean, that's a project that ended, but it was a very, very, very inspirational project. But other than that, our focus here is to try to support the growth and functioning of secondary cities, because Nepal has a huge concentration. The population of Kathmandu is growing by 5 to 6% per year. So that is a massive amount of people. That is migration mostly.
Okay. Yeah. Right. From rural settings, right? So there's less jobs in rural. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So that's not natural growth. It's not because people are having huge amount of children here in Nepal. They don't actually, I mean, if you look comparatively to other countries, but it is basically migration. And so in that setting, you want to, one, of course, support the city of Kathmandu to better absorb and manage this growth. And the other one is to try to make the other secondary cities viable centers for jobs and for education and for health. And so that is what this project is trying to do. We're just at the beginning. We're actually launching the project in 3 days. So you speak to us at a very good time.
Yeah.
We're having the press release and everything going out, and very excited. So that's the next 4 years, basically, for that project. So that's a very big 17 cities plus. We also have, of course, related to COVID, we have an additional set of activities related to, let's say, COVID recovery, because the economy here has also been impacted by COVID-19. We had a 5 months, almost full lockdown in a country where a lot of people are informal workers, and they don't, they can't work at home at their computers. They cannot sell their produce in the street because police will tell them to go home. So it's been a very hard period for a lot of people here. But now it's turning back to normal, let's say, at least in terms of the street life. So that's the project. So we hope. And then we have other activities here, but that's the main activity that I have, basically.
Sure, that's coming up. Sure. So what is your expectation for that project? So you're working on secondary cities. So is it to come up with a master plan? Is it to really see jobs developed? Like, what exactly is the outcome after your 4-year endeavor?
So the main outcome is, I think there's one thing is important in Nepal, is that 2015, after, I think one should understand, is quite important for the whole future of the country. But in 2015, after more than, I would say, 25, 30 years of sort of on-off conflict between different groups in society because of extreme unequal distribution of resources. So ended in around 2008-9, and then there was a protracted period of trying to figure out what is the future of the country in terms of constitution, because at that point, Nepal decided to abolish monarchy and shift towards a republic system. And so in 2015, a very federalist constitution was passed, which gives a lot of power to provinces and municipalities and districts compared to before, where you had a very centralized monarchy. So what we are trying to do is to support that endeavor to strengthen, let's say, also these institutions that are outside of the city, outside of the...
And they're basically in their infancy, right? These institutions
are infancy, very young. Yeah. So that is a big part of the project. The other part is to provide infrastructure because, to finance infrastructure. So that is basically a lot of roads, drainages, some sanitation, and some markets. So it's pretty basic stuff, but it's things that, based on, the things that have been, both the cities that have been selected as well as the roads, are seen to be the ones that can make a difference in terms of access to markets, produce being sold in central areas. Of course, it's the cost of transport and other things. So those are the key objectives. But basically, that's the overall scope. And then finally, we have this COVID, which is going to be where we will provide cash for work. Basically, the project will finance cash for work. So you will have basically youth, women, young men and women, plus vulnerable groups that will be given cash for work for small maintenance tasks and other things. And that is with a view to support because of this economic downturn and social stability, social, let's say, crisis that have erupted after COVID. So that is going to be the most urgent priority in the next 12 to 18 months. So those are so we see this project as very key in terms of helping, let's say, build institutions that are much more viable. Actually, when you compare, for instance, with Ghana or something where you had this system for much longer, the institutions, even if they're not 100% functioning, they are much more viable than here, where you have coming from this centralized monarchy to a much more democratic federalist system. That is a fascinating process, but it's also, again, one of the most challenging endeavors you can enter so full of politics and full of different interests.
Yeah, exactly. Special interests. So where do you see this being sustained? Because this is a new federalist program. How's the tax system? Like, where does sustainability show its face in this work?
Well, sustainability in terms of the results, I think is basically, you build institutions that are able to maintain and manage the investments, let's say the infrastructure investments, and that are the local governments that are able to collect taxes and to be obviously efficient in delivering future services, and then help them in planning also the future for their city. That's in terms of the results. But then on the other hand, of course, we also have a lot of attention around climate and impacts of climate change, because Nepal is one of among the top 5 countries that has the highest, let's say, that sees the highest impact of climate change in terms of changes in rainfall, in terms of land degradation, and in terms of other things. And that means that given the way the country is structured with huge mountains and also plains and so on, you have a high risk environment. So all the investments that the bank finances are basically required to be integrating this from the design and in the way they're delivered. So that's something we take extremely seriously in the way that this work is done. And that will continue to be a challenge going forward. But if we can help sustain that roads that we construct and the systems that we finance become part and parcel of such a sustainability agenda, then that's a big result for us.
Yeah. Interesting you bring up climate change and sustainability, because that is a huge issue now. In your mind, thinking just more globally, what do you think are, particularly in the developing world, because you've worked in so many different urban and peri-urban environments, and the flooding is a climate change issue, right? So you've confronted this in many of your projects. What do you think is the major thing, the one thing or one or two things that developing countries can and should do to address climate change on a very micro level?
So I think the first most important is probably around emissions, no? So that's basically the fleet of transport that you have in a city. And that's unfortunately here in Nepal and in Kathmandu very a current issue, because we had 3 weeks ago, we had about 600 in what they call, I think, the PM2 scale, which is basically a scale that measures air pollution. And that is basically 5 times above what is unhealthy. So that was one day, it was only one day, but it was downtown. It was not where I live, fortunately, but it was very, very bad. So that is just to say that the urgency is there, right? And there's no excuse. There's lots of cheap technology, cheap electrical vehicle transport systems. You can enforce legislation to phase out all your vehicles that are polluting the public transport system that is used by all train. So that is, I think, number one in terms of urban. Or more like trying to manage. It's more a pollution issue maybe than the climate as such, but it's definitely one. And then I think the other one is around maybe, I would say, trying to build, let's say, the future to last. So not only when you build infrastructure and you build grey, but also that you have sufficient green spaces within your city that allows you to, for instance, manage when floods are coming and when rivers are coming, that you're prepared for that. Because so those are all adaptation, let's say, aspects, because you have to adapt to whatever is coming from outside, right? So I think those are some of the things. And then, of course, for Nepal, I mean, the bigger challenge is the melting of the glaciers, which Himalaya, right, which is gradually releasing more and more ice. And so in that one, it's much more the global level. Of course, you can try to slow the train. But then also locally, of course, you have to think about where are people living in risky areas? Are they building? Are they constructing, and how do we manage that so our population is not losing life or losing health because of living in wrong areas? So I think those are some of the things you can do from my perspective. But of course, beyond that, there's lots of stuff around taxes and, trying to shift that people don't consume so much petrol and all of that. But that's more macro level things.
Right. Those are great. I love those. So what I will do, listeners, is I think there's probably plenty of literature and I'll ask Jonas for some as well, that kind of speaks to some of these things to add to the show notes, because we all have a duty, folks. The climate is ours. We got to take care of it. So let's move into a mindset hack, which I think goes nicely with what we've just spoken about. So this is where I ask, what is your favorite or an innovative mindset hack? Now, this is one that you can imagine or one that you know of.
So, I think what makes me what stimulates, I think, my thought process is probably around being in nature and moving, let's say, being active. So running is something that always coming back to me more than just exercise. Is also just being in a flow and being in a different kind of, sort of leaving behind all the other things that may be in your daily life and just being focused on your breathing and your surroundings and just trying to be in your senses, so to speak.
Yes, I love that.
So that's something I think that always comes back to inspire. And here I've also been lucky enough to find routes and areas that constantly can give me new perspective, even if I'm stuck with some problem or otherwise grappling with something that is tricky, then can give new energy, even if it doesn't give solutions. So that's inspiration to me. And then on top of that, I think it's in this COVID times where we work from home and have done so for so long, it's a very important part, because otherwise you end up sitting quite along in this confined and a little bit stressed space where you just constantly go from call to call or write emails and so on. And then I think that is very important to switch that out with something else. So in here, in this area, it's been fantastic, because also it's like a little journey into a new culture every time you step out and especially because we haven't lived here before, you see kids in the street, or you see a Brahmin coming down, he's going to give some blessing to one house, and then you come past the local big temple we have down the street, and then there's some other activity going on. There's a political demonstration, or people are just shopping before going home. So it's a whole micro life that plays out for you. And so it's good that you just get a sense, okay, beyond all this email and phones, there's people are living their lives and dealing with their issues, and kids are going to school, and, things are there. So it's a good thing now that I cannot go to visit and see my counterparts and the mayors and citizens or anyone because of the restrictions of COVID, which is very frustrating, right? So that's, I think, the mind hack continues to be. And then hiking in the weekends and going is also one of my, and then music. But I don't play myself, but more so singing a bit, and of course listening to exploring different new music that is emerging that I just can be inspirational.
Okay. So basically stimulating your senses. I like that a lot. And so tell me, because I grew up at above altitude in Colorado, so the mile high city. And how was your adjustment to running in Nepal?
That's been was challenging in the beginning for sure. But now I felt it was, before we left, we had a lot of hiatus in Europe over the summer because of COVID. But before we left, I had very good stamina at the end. It helped strengthen my stamina clearly because of the changes and the altitude. And sort of just 300-400 height meters in one run, you go up and down, and then you really feel it. So that's been great. So now I feel fully acclimatized.
Okay, wonderful.
But it's still, you cannot compete with the mountain runners there are here in the region that are or in the country, Nepali and expats that are doing 60, 70 kilometer runs around the ridges. And that's a whole other...
That's an Ironman. That's an Ironman. We'll leave those for the Ironman challenges. Wow, nice. Okay, so I really have loved this conversation. I like just learning so much more about another part of the world. So you mentioned music, and I'll ask you this so you can give us a sense. We want to know more about who you are, and you've given us a sense of that, and less about what you do. So you mentioned music, but what are you reading? So are you a listener, are you a watcher, or are you a reader?
Well, I'm a bit of both, I guess, but right now, the time of all three. I'm not reading that much. I'm mostly reading work reports, outside of work stuff. And then reading stories from my daughter, which is always a great joy.
What's her favorite story?
Well, she has several, actually. At the moment, I don't think there's such a favorite one. But one thing that we enjoy, which combines music and storytelling, is a deck of cards that she have, which has all, probably, 50 Danish children's songs in those cards. And each card has an illustration. And so at her age, there's a very nice dynamic where she engages with the picture. Meanwhile, I sing the song. And so we kind of have a dialogue around that. So that's a very nice hybrid of singing and reading, kind of, and talking about the
language. So do you speak? So are you speaking? Is she learning Danish as well as English, and I think your wife is also not American. So is she learning 3 languages?
No, at the moment, only Danish and English. I've encouraged my wife to speak Amharic to her, but it's, I guess, she came young to US. So I think she can speak it, but it's, maybe later she will add it.
Okay.
We're planning this year, hopefully, to go to Ethiopia, actually, because then we will be able to, if time allows and if COVID allows,
to do some
connect
immersion
with the other part of the culture. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. So the deck of cards, okay. So you're doing a little bit
the deck of cards, and then singing. I used to sing in choir, but here I haven't found a choir. But I love singing very much, so I think that's something that can be also at the level of running. Actually, can be very, very, very inspirational, and have given me a lot of joy. I've sung in maybe 5-6 choirs over the last many years, but something that is because if you don't master an instrument, then I think singing can
your voice is an instrument.
Quite,
yes, exactly.
Can be quite inspirational. So that's on the music side, and then I think sensing. Still a taste and everything that has to do with cooking and engaging on visual arts and so on is also something I find very inspiring. So that's kind of a bit all over, but it just takes at this moment.
I think we've already recognized you're kind of a Renaissance man, so being all over the place is okay. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Do you have any last words for now?
No, just stay safe and enjoy the moment when hopefully within this year we start living in a slightly less confined world.
Yeah.
So that becomes liberating for all of us, and I think that's needed. But of course, there's a lot more people that are having a lot more difficult time than sitting in front of a computer working than, and still having all your livelihood. So that's also not to forget to be humble and think about, how much worse it could be. So I think that's respect, have that humility is always healthy, I think. So you are grateful for whatever things have been given.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Those are great last words. And stay safe. Thank you, Jonas. I really appreciate it. Yes. So, listeners, this has been another episode of the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around doing something in the world. I'm your host, Florence Adu. You can catch us each and every Tuesday with a new episode on www.glocalcitizenspod.com and wherever you get your podcasts. So Apple, Amazon, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcast. Just listen, learn, and subscribe. Send a comment. We love to hear from you. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the other side when I'm back in Ghana, still doing remote interviews, but nonetheless, still I'm bringing you great guests with insightful conversations. So until next time, bye for now.